Part 1: The Wound and the Whispered Secret. The Redwood Veterinary Clinic was Elara Vance's fortress of solitude. Tucked away on a lonely stretch of road winding through the towering, fog-kissed coastal redwoods of Northern California, it was remote enough to suit her need for anonymity. At 30, she carried the quiet resignation of someone who had seen too much human tragedy and deliberately chosen the predictable loyalty of animals. Her scars were not physical, but they were deep enough to make her distrustful of sudden noise, unexpected visitors, and, most of all, complex men. It was just past 5 o'clock. The last hint of the weak winter sun was being swallowed by the dense canopy. Elara had already finished her final chart, a tricky case of bloat in an old boxer, and was locking up, the heavy key turning with a satisfying, final click. Kaiser, her imposing German shepherd and the clinic's unofficial security chief, was already waiting by her battered pickup truck, his tail giving a single, expectant thump against the fender. That's when she saw it. Not immediately in the harsh beam of the clinic's security light, but further down the gravel drive, partially concealed beneath the looming shadow of a giant redwood. A black SUV. It wasn't just dirty, it was scorched. The passenger side window was completely blown out, replaced by a jagged, blackened hole, and the entire rear panel looked like it had been chewed by fire. Her hand instinctively went to the pepper spray clipped inside her parka pocket. Kaiser didn't growl. He let out a low, almost mournful whine, his ears flattening slightly, a sound Elara had never heard directed at a threat. Then, a shape detached itself from the vehicle's shadows. It was a man, large and dark-clad, moving with the heavy, uneven gait of someone clinging to consciousness by sheer willpower. He took 3 staggering steps before his massive frame leaned heavily against a weathered fence post. He looked up, and the clinic light finally caught his face, handsome in a severe, chiseled way, currently contorted by pain and a frightening desperation that cut through Elara's trained professional reserve. His expensive dark suit was ruined, soaked through on the right shoulder and chest. The blood wasn't dripping, it was already clotting and caking, indicating a deep, substantial wound that had been bleeding for hours. But worse than the blood was the sheen of sweat coating his forehead in the chilly air, and the slight, uncontrolled tremor in his limbs. High fever. Septic shock was already setting in. "Please," he rasped, the single word sounding like gravel grinding against bone. His eyes, dark and sharp despite the haze of fever, locked onto hers. "I need a doctor. Now." Elara's carefully constructed wall of isolation crumbled. This wasn't a drunk driver or a petty criminal, this was a man whose life was visibly slipping away, and he was begging. She didn't open the clinic door, she threw it wide. "Inside. Now. Don't touch anything." Dante Moretti stumbled into the sterile, antiseptic environment of the Redwood Veterinary Clinic, a brutal contrast to the pristine stainless steel and tile. The moment he was inside, the exhaustion hit him like a physical blow, and he nearly collapsed onto a stainless steel examination table. "No time for questions," Elara snapped, her professional focus kicking in, erasing the fear. "Shirt off. Lie still." She worked with the frantic efficiency born from years of patching up farm animals mangled by machinery or wild predators. Dante's shirt, what remained of it, was cut away with surgical shears. The wound was horrific, a deep, jagged gash spanning nearly 6 inches across his upper back and shoulder, probably caused by shrapnel or a deep grazing shot. It was infected, angry, and required immediate closure. She didn't have human anesthetic, but she had lidocaine and bupivacaine, designed for large animals but effective enough to dull the worst of the pain. She administered a hefty dose. As she scrubbed the area, a necessary but excruciating process, Dante grit his teeth, the only sound a low, guttural moan that reminded her he wasn't a creature to be handled lightly. Her equipment was basic. She used a needle driver designed for thick cattle hide and heavy silk suture, not ideal for fine human flesh, but strong enough to hold the wound together. She worked fast, stitch after careful stitch, trying to ignore the heat radiating from his skin. Throughout the improvised surgery, Kaiser performed his own unique examination. Instead of guarding the door or staying by Elara's side, the massive dog padded softly to the exam table and lay down directly beneath it, his head resting on the cold steel floor, looking up at the man. Dante's hand, unconsciously, twitched toward the dog, and Kaiser simply closed his eyes, a silent, furry guardian. It was a connection Elara couldn't explain. Kaiser never tolerated strangers. As the lidocaine began to fade and the fever took firmer hold, Dante drifted into a restless, fevered delirium. Elara was halfway through the 23rd stitch, her brow furrowed in concentration, when the muddled whisper started. The shipment block at Astoria needs to be rerouted, not the bridge, Silas, the ferry. Elara paused, the needle hovering over his skin. Rerouted shipment? Ferry? She dismissed it as nonsense, but the next words were spoken with a terrifying, absolute clarity, the voice hoarse and broken by pain, yet carrying the weight of command. Tell Serafina to initiate the fallback. If Kirov gets the manifest, initiate Project Cerberus, the kill order is clean. Cerberus, only Cerberus. Elara's blood ran cold. This wasn't the rambling of a sick man, it was tactical intelligence. A shiver of pure, primal warning ran through her, telling her to stop listening. But her curiosity, and a sense of self-preservation, forced her to pay attention. She had learned long ago that knowledge, even if terrifying, was power. Without looking away from her stitching, she used her other hand to pull a blank prescription pad toward her and scribbled the key phrases down: Project Cerberus, Astoria Ferry, Kirov. She didn't understand them, but they sounded lethal. She finished the final stitch, tying the knot tightly, and applied a heavy sterile dressing. As she cleaned up the blood-soaked materials, Dante finally slipped into a deeper, drug-induced sleep, his chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths. She was scrubbing her hands, staring at the cryptic notes on the prescription pad, when the night exploded. A sudden, sharp crack of gunfire tore through the silence of the redwoods. The window in the small waiting area instantly shattered, showering the floor with tempered glass. Elara froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. Before she could process the sound, Kaiser exploded from his resting place with a terrifying, deafening bark, rushing toward the front door, his hackles raised high. Two black, window-tinted sedans, unmarked and identical to the scorched SUV's general shape, screeched to a halt outside the clinic's entrance. Two figures, clad in black tactical gear, burst out of the cars. They weren't looking for help, they were looking for a body. One of the men, lean and quick, leveled a suppressed semi-automatic weapon and deliberately shot the old wooden clinic sign, the one with the faded picture of a golden retriever, until it was splintered beyond recognition. The other man, heavier, moved straight to Elara's pickup truck and doused the tires and undercarriage with a container of gasoline. The second sound was the roar of fire, engulfing her only means of escape in an angry, hungry orange plume. They were sending a message: they knew he was here, and they would destroy everything connected to him. Dante was awake instantly. Not groggy or confused, but a man of pure, immediate action. He rolled off the exam table, ignoring the blinding tear of his fresh stitches, and moved with a terrifying economy of motion. Down. Stay down, he roared, his voice raw but commanding, pushing Elara behind the bulky X-ray machine. He scanned the room for a weapon, finding only a metal broom handle, which he discarded. They've found us. Versani. They won't leave a witness. He didn't wait. He grabbed a heavy fleece blanket from the supply shelf, and before Elara could protest, he used his substantial weight to shove her out the back emergency door, through the small, muddy run-off kennel. You're coming with me, he bit out, his good arm clamped around her like an iron vice. "You know, Cerberus. You patched me up. You've seen their faces. You're compromised. You're dead if you stay." He dragged her toward the woods, away from the burning truck. The stench of smoke and gasoline choked the air, mixing sickeningly with the metallic scent of his own renewed bleeding. Elara resisted, fighting him with a desperate, animal strength. "Let go. You can't force me. This is my home." Dante didn't slow down. He paused only to retrieve a heavy-duty satellite phone from the scorched SUV's back seat, then slammed the door. "Your home is a kill zone now, Doctor," Dante snarled, his breath ragged. He pointed back toward the clinic, where the gunmen were methodically shattering every window. "You chose to involve yourself when you took me in. Now, I own your safety. You know my secrets, and they know you exist. You are coming to the Moretti compound in Malibu. It's the only place they can't touch you, or the secrets you carry." He didn't wait for her reply, yanking her deeper into the thick, dark redwood forest. Kaiser, his guttural barks now fading into the distance, followed faithfully, trotting directly behind the man who had just brought violence and fire back into Elara's carefully isolated life. Dante Moretti, the blood-soaked mob boss, was dragging his unwilling savior straight into the heart of a merciless war. Elara Vance knew, with cold certainty, that the 23 stitches she had just placed in his back were nothing compared to the irreparable wound he had just inflicted upon her life. Their fate was sealed on that bloody examination table. Part 2: Coercion and Betrayal. The journey from the ravaged redwoods of Northern California to the guarded, sun-drenched hills of Malibu was a blur of frantic speed and heavy silence. Dante, his arm still bleeding sluggishly beneath the makeshift bandage, drove a stolen, unmarked sedan, flanked by two identical security vehicles that seemed to materialize out of the darkness within minutes of his satellite call. Elara sat stiffly beside him, Kaiser's large head resting heavily in her lap, his presence the only familiar anchor in the nightmare she was living. Dante never apologized for the coercion. He spoke only in clipped, necessary commands, maintaining a cold authority that was meant to reassure her of his control, but only served to deepen her fear. He was not a savior, he was a proprietor, treating her as a highly valuable, highly unstable asset. The Moretti compound was an architectural paradox, a structure of stunning, minimalist beauty, all glass, concrete, and terraced gardens, built deep into the hillside, giving the impression of an impregnable bunker looking out over the glittering expanse of the Pacific Ocean. It was opulence cloaked in paranoia. As soon as they passed through the double-guarded gates, Elara was whisked away not by Dante, but by a woman who moved with the lethal grace of a drawn stiletto. This was Serafina Moretti, Dante's younger sister and the family's chief strategist and financial mind. Serafina was exquisitely tailored and perfectly composed, a chilling contrast to Dante's raw, blood-stained exhaustion. Serafina's greeting was immediate and hostile. Her eyes, the same dark, intense color as Dante's, raked over Elara's dirty clothes and the singed remnants of her parka, lingering on the frantic, desperate look in her eyes. "Welcome, Dr. Vance," Serafina said, her voice smooth and devoid of warmth, like polished ice. "You have caused us considerable trouble in a very short amount of time." Elara stood her ground, clutching Kaiser's leash. "I didn't cause anything. Your brother bled all over my clinic and then kidnapped me after his enemies tried to burn me alive." Serafina offered a tight, unsettling smile. "Semantics. The fact remains, you are now a loose thread in a very delicate tapestry. My brother is compromised by your existence. We must secure our interests and yours." She led Elara into a luxurious guest suite, more of a standalone apartment, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a dizzying drop to the ocean. On the desk, illuminated by a reading lamp, sat a thick, official-looking document. "This is non-negotiable," Serafina stated, her gaze unwavering. She didn't ask, she commanded. "A standard non-disclosure agreement and a liability waiver. You sign this, you agree that everything you have seen, heard, or treated is confidential, forever. Furthermore, any attempt to leave this property without my explicit, written authorization will be viewed as an act of hostility and direct engagement with our enemies. You will be held responsible for the consequences." Elara felt the blood drain from her face. "You're forcing me to sign a contract that makes me a prisoner, and if I try to escape, you'll treat me like a rival syndicate." "Precisely," Serafina confirmed, tapping the pen against the paper. "We are at war, Dr. Vance. And whether you like it or not, you are now standing on the front lines. Dante is recuperating, he will not be fully functional for 24 hours. You sign. Now." Elara stared at the document, then at the elegant, ruthless woman before her. She saw no weakness, only the cold, calculated intent to protect the family at all costs, even if it meant sacrificing Elara's freedom and peace. With a tremor in her hand that had nothing to do with fear of the document and everything to do with the loss of choice, Elara picked up the pen and signed the name she now understood to be meaningless, Elara Vance. In the days that followed, Elara settled into a peculiar routine of captivity. Her medical expertise was indispensable. She tended to Dante's sutures twice a day, changing the dressings and monitoring for infection, pushing antibiotics designed for livestock into the man who ran a criminal empire. It was during these quiet, intimate moments that the true nature of Dante Moretti began to surface. Stripped of the suit, lying vulnerable and feverish, he was not the cold proprietor who had dragged her through the redwoods. He was tired. Profoundly, bone-deep tired. He never flinched during the pain of the dressing changes, demonstrating a monumental discipline. But his eyes, when they weren't fixed on the war maps and financial projections Serafina brought in, often settled on Elara with an expression she recognized, a deep, aching exhaustion that mirrored her own flight from the tragedy of her past. She saw the burden of the crown he wore. She saw a man who had tried, genuinely, to turn the family business legitimate, only to be dragged back into the bloody mire by the aggression of Viktor Kirov and the Versoni-Bratva alliance. Dante, in turn, was fascinated by her. Her hands, the hands that could suture a deep, life-threatening wound with steady, unflinching precision, were what had drawn him in the first place. But it was her resilience, the refusal to cower despite the fire and the gunshots, that captivated him. She was an unexpected patch of solid ground in his chaotic, crumbling world. One evening, 4 days after their arrival, the tension that had been crackling between them finally snapped. Elara had just finished checking his temperature and wounds. The antibiotic had broken the fever, leaving him weak but clear-headed. "Thank you, Elara," he murmured, the use of her first name sounding incredibly personal in his deep, resonant voice. "You saved my life, and I repay you by making you a prisoner." "Don't mistake professional duty for compassion, Mr. Moretti," she countered, her voice low. "And don't mistake my confinement for gratitude. I signed the paper under duress." He sat up slowly, leaning against the pillows, his gaze intense. "I understand. But I didn't drag you here to hurt you. I dragged you here because when they found me, they marked you. If I had left you, Kirov's dogs would have found you by morning. They would have questioned you about what I said, and then they would have used you to get to me. And they wouldn't have been gentle." He reached out, his large hand gently cupping her chin, forcing her to meet his gaze. "The only way to keep you safe from me is to keep you safe with me." That night, the lines of patient and doctor, captor and captive, blurred and vanished. In the heavy stillness of the fortified room, looking out over the endless dark ocean, they found a raw, desperate solace in each other. It was a fierce, consuming release of the tension, fear, and solitude they both carried. For Dante, Elara was an escape hatch from the war and the expectation of his name. For Elara, Dante was a terrifying, irresistible force that finally shattered the lonely prison she had built around herself. When they finally slept, tangled together in the cool linen, it was the first time Dante had truly known peace since Kirov betrayed him. Kaiser, ever the silent judge, remained curled on the rug, guarding the door. The next morning, the fragile peace was violently shattered. Elara awoke first, dressing quickly in a borrowed shirt, her mind still fuzzy from the emotional and physical intensity of the previous night. She went to the kitchenette for coffee, the rich scent a welcome normality. As she passed the closed double doors of Dante's study, she heard the raised, angry tones of a confrontation. "You are sentimental, Dante. You're letting the wound, and the woman, blind you." The voice belonged to Silas, Dante's cold, analytical right-hand man. Elara froze, flattening herself against the wall, her heart beginning to pound with cold dread. Dante's voice was a low growl. "She is a doctor, Silas. She saved my life. She is a liability, yes, but she is not a tool. She is a godsend." Silas hissed, his voice full of chilling enthusiasm. "Kirov knows your vulnerability. He knows you never bring a civilian inside, certainly not to the compound. He will smell the weakness. I told you before, this is the only way to draw him out of his rat hole. We use her as the live bait." Elara's stomach dropped. Live bait. Silas had planned it. Her captivity, her danger, wasn't just a byproduct of his injury, it was a strategy. Dante's response was a thunderous, table-shaking slam. "I said no. I cancelled the plan the moment Serafina brought the contract. She is off limits. I will find Kirov another way." "You are never to mention that plan again, Silas, do you understand me?" "Never." The sound of Dante's fury was genuine. He had cancelled it. But the confirmation that the plan had existed in the first place, that she had been, for a few hours, a tactical sacrificial lamb, was a betrayal so deep it eclipsed the sudden violence of the night they met. Her brief moment of tenderness, the trust she had felt in the dark, evaporated, leaving behind a sharp, clean shard of pure rage. She pushed the door open, ignoring the shocked silence that fell over the two men. "You cancelled it," Elara stated, her voice dangerously calm, focusing solely on Dante, who was now standing, his face pale with alarm. But the thought was there. "You brought me here, not to protect me, but to calculate my usefulness against your enemy." Dante moved toward her, his expression a mixture of guilt and concern. "Elara, listen to me. It was a suggestion, a terrible one, and I shut it down. Serafina and Silas were overly cautious." "Cautious?" Elara cut him off, laughing, a dry, hysterical sound. "You know what's cautious? Staying in my clinic, away from your war. You compromised me, Dante. You chose to use me, even if you changed your mind later." The anger was so overwhelming that she didn't realize the gravity of the words leaving her mouth until they were hanging in the air. "You're wrong," she spat, her eyes blazing. "I'm not just live bait. I'm a risk you can't afford. Because I know all your little secrets. I know what you mumbled when I was stitching your back. You mentioned the Astoria ferry. You mentioned Kirov. And you mentioned Project Cerberus." The effect was instantaneous and absolute. Dante Moretti, the ruthless boss who could command fear with a glance, froze. The anger, the guilt, the concern, it all drained away, replaced by a look of sheer, terrible realization. His defenses, which had been weakened by his illness and their shared night, utterly collapsed. He knew, instantly, that she wasn't just a witness or a doctor. She was a vault containing the most critical strategic code word in the Moretti family's current conflict. The kill order. The final, devastating contingency plan. Elara, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, devoid of feeling. You have no idea what you just said. I know enough to demand my freedom, she declared, stepping back, retrieving Kaiser, who stood beside her, his low growl confirming his alignment. I want to go home. Now. I want to be driven back to what's left of my life today. If you refuse, or if you stall, I will make sure the name Project Cerberus is known by every agency and every reporter who takes an anonymous call. You brought me into this war, Dante. Now, I dictate the terms of my surrender. Dante stood motionless for a long moment, the silent weight of his decision heavy in the room. He saw the fire in her eyes, the steel backbone he had admired, now turned against him. She was not bluffing. If she spoke that name, the entire plan, his only chance of neutralizing Kirov and ending the war, would be compromised. She had to be released. For her own protection, and for the security of Project Cerberus. He finally nodded, the movement slow and agonizing. Silas, Dante commanded, his voice tight with controlled fury. Arrange a full security escort. 3 cars, 20 men. Weapons free. The doctor is to be escorted back to the nearest safe civilian area in Humboldt County. Do not stop. Do not allow anyone near the convoy. If anyone touches her, you will answer to me. He looked back at Elara, his eyes dark with a complicated mix of regret and renewed resolve. You will have your freedom, Elara. But you are not safe. And you will be watched. We both know this isn't over. Part 3, The Abduction and the Horrifying Revelation. The convoy assigned to return Elara was not an escort, it was a brazen, armed statement. 3 heavy black armored SUVs, windows opaque, carrying a complement of Dante's most trusted men led by Silas himself. The sheer overkill confirmed every terrible suspicion Elara harbored. She was not merely a civilian, she was an object of tactical value, and her life, while no longer entirely her own, was now tied irrevocably to the fortunes of the Moretti family. Elara sat in the middle SUV, Kaiser pressed close to her feet, his massive body vibrating with low-frequency alertness that mirrored her own mounting tension. They followed the winding coastal highway north, the road carving perilous paths between the sheer cliffs and the crashing Pacific. The sea air, cold and bracing, did little to clear the metallic taste of betrayal from Elara's mouth. She kept her gaze fixed on the receding coastline, avoiding eye contact with the men in the car, particularly Silas, whose cold, calculating demeanor was now stained with the knowledge that he had been ready to use her as bait. Don't let your guard down, Dr. Vance, Silas murmured, his voice as flat as the glass protecting them. Dante may have dismissed the plan, but Kirov is not stupid. He knows we found him, and he knows we have something he wants. He'll be watching. If you truly believe I'm in danger, why not keep me at your fortress? Elara challenged, her voice tight. Silas gave her a thin, almost pitying look. Because Dante chose you over the mission. He chose to protect his leverage over the objective. A weakness Kirov will exploit. You are safer for the family now that you are away, but you are not safer for yourself. The drive was relentless, stretching through the entire day. As dusk began to settle, a thick, gray blanket of coastal fog rolling in from the ocean, the convoy was traveling through a particularly desolate section of the highway near the Oregon border. The cliffs here were steeper, the trees thicker, and the ocean a relentless, roaring void below. Suddenly, the silence was ripped apart by a sound that made the gunfire at the clinic sound like firecrackers, the deep, rumbling thwomp 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 of heavy ordnance. The lead SUV, traveling about 100 yards ahead, simply ceased to exist. Not a collision, but an instant, spectacular fragmentation. A brilliant flash of blinding orange light, followed by a shockwave that rattled the teeth in Elara's head. The vehicle was annihilated, fragments of armored plating and shattered debris raining down onto the road and into the ocean below. RPG. Ambush. Silas screamed into his headset, the calm facade utterly shattered. The attack was not a drive-by shooting or a clumsy skirmish. It was a precise, military-grade assault. The air immediately filled with the deafening roar of automatic rifle fire, not the scattered, fearful shots of petty criminals, but coordinated, sustained barrages that ripped into the metal of their vehicle. The attackers were using armor-piercing rounds. The sedan was shaking violently under the impact. Silas threw the steering wheel hard, swerving the SUV off the road and plunging it into the thin cover of the trees, narrowly avoiding a second explosion aimed at their rear. "Kaiser, stay!" Elara commanded the dog, her voice raw, as Silas opened his door and yelled orders to the two remaining men in the third car. "We are exposed. Kirov is using military hardware. Get the doctor out. Move her into the tree line, now." The fight was over almost before it began. Dante's men, though elite, were fighting a pitched, one-sided battle against an enemy using superior firepower and tactical position. The third car was quickly disabled, its engine smoking, and the sound of screams mingled with the rattle of gunfire. Silas, moving with frantic, desperate speed, grabbed Elara's arm. "Move. Follow me." He dragged her out of the vehicle and into the dense forest, the noise of the ambush fading slightly behind the enormous trunks of the redwoods. But as they crashed through the undergrowth, a new sound emerged, a pair of boots pounding the earth behind them. Silas shoved Elara behind a massive log. Before he could turn and engage, a shadow detached itself from the gloom. A thick-set, cold-eyed man in heavy, dark fatigue stood over Silas, holding not a rifle, but a heavy, matte black garrote wire, which he wrapped around Silas's neck with brutal speed. There was a brief, silent struggle, a horrible, gasping wheeze, and then Silas crumpled to the ground, unconscious or dead. Elara screamed, a high, panicked sound that was immediately silenced by the appearance of the leader. He was impeccably dressed, even in the middle of a forest firefight, wearing a tailored coat and expensive leather gloves. His face was familiar to Elara from the grainy photos Serafina had left on the compound desk, but infinitely colder, radiating a cruel intelligence that turned her blood to ice. Viktor Kirov. The man Dante had feared most. The traitor. "Dr. Vance," Kirov greeted her, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone with a faint, harsh Russian accent. He didn't sound excited or triumphant, merely satisfied. "I apologize for the mess. But your boyfriend insisted on sending an army to the woods when a simple taxi would have sufficed." Kirov didn't touch her. He simply gestured to two of his men, who moved swiftly, pinning her arms and covering her mouth before she could utter another sound. The last thing Elara saw before a thick, chemical-smelling cloth was pressed over her face was Kaiser, lunging forward with a ferocious, heartbroken bark that was cut short by a heavy, precise blow to his skull. Elara woke up to the smell of rust, salt, and stale oil. Her head throbbed, and her wrists and ankles were chafed raw by heavy metal restraints. She was cuffed to a cold, grimy metal table in a large, echoing space that looked and felt exactly like an abandoned shipping warehouse. The rhythmic clang and groan outside suggested she was near a bustling industrial port. Seattle, she realized with a fresh spike of terror. They were far from the Moretti territory. Kirov was sitting opposite her at a card table, meticulously cleaning a set of small, gleaming silver tools, surgical instruments. He looked up, his smile slow and chilling. "You're awake. Good." The journey was regrettably uncomfortable, but we had to be quick. Elara struggled uselessly against the restraints. "Why me? You have Dante's men. You have Silas. Why me?" Kirov chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. You misunderstand your value, Doctor. The men are disposable. Silas is predictable. You, however, are Dante's blind spot. His weakness. I knew this was coming. I was the one who taught Dante how to strategize, how to avoid sentimentality. And I was there when he abandoned every lesson for you. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his eyes boring into hers. You heard the argument, didn't you? Silas's beautiful plan used the doctor as live bait. Dante refused, of course. Sentimental fool. He thought he was protecting you by sending you away with that ridiculous caravan. But he made a fatal error. He confirmed your importance to me. Kirov's smile widened, revealing a calculated malice. I knew that the moment he decided to keep you. I've known for days. Did you truly believe he cancelled the plan? No. You were the plan. His refusal to use you was the signal. It told me, Viktor Kirov, that you were the one thing he cared about more than his war. Ilara's mind raced back to the night at the compound. The tenderness, the shared desperation, the profound sense of peace Dante had found in her arms. Was it all a manipulation? A subtle, psychological ploy to cement her loyalty before she escaped, ensuring her silence? He told me he cancelled it, she whispered, the raw betrayal in her voice making the words tremble. Perhaps he believed it himself, Kirov conceded dismissively. But the outcome is the same. The difference is, now he thinks he is protecting you, which makes his pain all the sweeter. Kirov stood and walked over to a workbench, picking up a satellite phone. He manipulated it expertly before holding it up to show Ilara the screen, a picture, taken moments ago, showing her chained to the table, her face pale with terror and dried blood from the struggle. A token of our new partnership, Kirov said, sending the message. I'm asking Dante for a ransom. 5 million. Control of half of Portland's port operations. Trivial requests, really. But the final item is the most important, and the reason for our little meeting. He returned to the card table, his fingers lingering on the surgical tools. I want Project Cerberus. All of it. The manifest, the location, the kill codes, everything he withheld from the family. You, Dr. Vance, are my leverage to pry that secret loose. He won't let you die for a piece of paper, especially not when the cost is so beautifully specific. Kirov picked up a delicate-looking scalpel and tested its razor edge with his thumb, the action meticulous and unnervingly calm. You have beautiful hands, Doctor. Steady. Precise. The tools of your trade, the things that saved Dante's worthless life. He tapped the scalpel lightly against her cuffed wrist. Dante values them. He loves them. So, I will take them from you. We're going to perform a small operation, just a few millimeters of tendon and bone. Nothing immediately fatal. But enough to ensure you never hold a surgical needle again. Enough to ensure Dante watches his weakness bleed out onto the floor. The horrifying realization slammed into Ilara, making the large warehouse spin. This wasn't about money or territory, it was about psychological torture, forcing Dante to relive the failure of his leadership through the suffering of the only innocent person he had allowed into his orbit. Kirov pulled on a pair of latex gloves, the snap of the elastic echoing loudly in the immense space. He leaned over Ilara, the scalpel gleaming under the weak overhead light, ready to destroy the hands that had saved his enemy. Shall we begin, Dr. Vance? Part 4, The Ultimate Sacrifice and the Vow. Back at the Moretti compound in Malibu, the receipt of Kirov's ultimatum, the photograph of Ilara chained to the table, the demands for territory, cash, and, critically, Project Cerberus, ignited an explosion of controlled fury in Dante Moretti. He was still recovering, his sutures taut and painful, but the fear for Ilara instantly cauterized any sense of physical weakness. He was in his study, a secure, soundproofed room overlooking the black expanse of the Pacific. Serafina and Silas, who had miraculously survived the ambush by feigning death and escaping through the coastal fog, stood before him, their faces grim. "He has her in Seattle. A warehouse near the docks," Dante stated, his voice dangerously low, his hands gripping the mahogany desk until his knuckles were white. "He wants Cerberus. He knows. He knew the moment I sent her away." Serafina, ever the pragmatist, saw the opening. "Dante, this is it. He's exposed. He thinks he has leverage. We give him a partial manifest, we trace the satellite signature, and we hit him with everything we have. It's the perfect, final trap. He doesn't want the money or the territory, Serafina. He wants to watch me break. He wants to take her hands," Dante said, his gaze distant, seeing the gleaming scalpel in the picture. "He knows those hands saved me. He knows I love them. This is personal, Victor's last, spiteful lesson." Silas stepped forward, his neck still bruised from the garrote. "I can mobilize Delta Team. They are the best at extraction. We hit hard and fast. But Dante, you cannot go. You're wound." Dante rose to his full height, pulling on a dark, heavy trench coat that concealed his injuries and his armor. "He asked for me. He will get me. Kirov knows every strategy one taught you, Silas. He knows how I delegate. He will expect me to send an army. He won't expect me to be the first man through the door." He turned to Serafina, his final command absolute. "Prepare Project Cerberus. All of it. If I don't return, upload the data and initiate the final phase. End this war, Serafina. But first, I will save the only non-combatant involved." The planning was brutal and swift. Within hours, a private jet was airborne, carrying a small, deadly strike team. Dante used every covert resource the Moretti network possessed, exploiting old intelligence connections and high-tech satellite scans, tracing the communication signal Kirov had used to send the photo. The coordinates led them to a derelict wharfside district in Seattle. The infiltration was textbook, silent, and swift until the moment Dante's team breached the main warehouse doors. The warehouse was a cavern of darkness, punctuated by harsh, single light bulbs hanging over two figures, Ilara, chained and terrified, and Kirov, standing over her with a gloved hand holding the scalpel, ready to strike. "Dante!" Such predictable gallantry, Kirov called out, his voice echoing in the vast space. "You came alone. I should be flattered." The surrounding gloom instantly erupted with the roar of Russian and Versoni heavy automatic fire. The raid, intended as a clean extraction, devolved immediately into a cacophony of hellfire. Dante's men were immediately pinned down by superior numbers and preset firing positions. Dante ignored the chaos. His focus was laser-sharp, Ilara. He moved, not with grace, but with raw, brute force, using the crates and containers as cover, charging straight through the heaviest line of fire. He was a man possessed, his breathing ragged, the pain from his barely healed wound a constant, blinding presence. He returned fire with deadly accuracy, dropping 3 Bratva guards with surgical precision. He found Kirov and Ilara shielded behind a stack of crates. Kirov saw him coming and fired, the bullet whizzing past Dante's ear and embedding itself in the metal behind him. "Too late, Dante!" Kirov yelled triumphantly, raising the scalpel, aiming for Ilara's delicate wrist. Dante didn't aim his pistol, he threw his entire body into the attack, tackling Kirov away from Ilara. They slammed against the cold concrete floor, Dante's fresh sutures ripping open beneath his coat, sending a fresh, hot wave of blood soaking his back. The two men rolled, locked in a ferocious, silent duel fueled by years of rivalry and a desperate fight for survival. Kirov was colder, more precise, a tactical fighter. Dante was larger, driven by raw, animalistic need. The fight ended violently. Kirov managed to gain the upper hand, pulling a slim knife from his boot. He plunged it sideways, deep into Dante's flank, exactly mirroring the placement of the previous injury. Dante roared, a sound of pure agony and rage, but the distraction gave him the opening he needed. He smashed his elbow into Kirov's face, loosening the grip on the knife, and then, using the last of his strength, he pressed his pistol against Kirov's chest and fired twice. Kirov's body convulsed, then went limp. Silence descended, broken only by Ilara's frantic sobs and the distant, fading exchange of fire as Dante's men secured the perimeter. Dante pushed Kirov's lifeless weight aside and collapsed heavily beside Ilara, pulling a small key from Kirov's coat pocket. His eyes were glazed over, his face ashen, but he managed a trembling, victorious smile. "Cerberus is safe," he wheezed, unlocking her restraints. Ilara's hands, free but shaking uncontrollably, immediately went to his back, pressing uselessly against the soaking, torn coat. "Dante! You're bleeding, we need to stop the bleeding," both of them. The next few hours were a rush of emergency triage in the dark warehouse, followed by a frantic rush back to Malibu. Both Dante and Ilara were in critical condition, needing multiple transfusions and complex trauma repair. Ilara had suffered only minor physical injuries, but the psychological toll was immense. Dante, however, had nearly bled out twice. Weeks passed in the heavily secured intensive care unit established within the Moretti compound. When Dante was finally well enough to be moved, he called Ilara to his side. He was pale and gaunt, but his eyes were clear, holding a depth of certainty she had never seen before. "I made a promise to myself in that warehouse, Ilara," he rasped, holding her hand, which was still prone to nervous tremors. "I was ready to burn everything, the family, the business, the plan, to get you back. I realized that my life of shadows, my half-hearted attempts to go legitimate, weren't enough. They endangered the only light I've ever found." He took a deep breath. "I have already signed the full legal transfer of the Moretti organization to Serafina. Effective immediately, she runs the business, and she will handle the public transition and the fallout from Kirov's demise. In exactly 12 months, I will be formally and publicly divested from every operation that isn't strictly legitimate, legal, and auditable. I don't want our children to be born into the dark, Ilara. Not even for a minute." It wasn't a question or a plea, it was a simple, profound declaration of sacrifice. He was giving up the empire, the power, the very identity he had fought to maintain. Ilara looked into his eyes and saw the raw, honest commitment to change. The betrayal she had felt was erased by this ultimate, painful act of devotion. "I choose you, Dante," she said, her voice husky with emotion. "I choose to fight for the light, as long as you're fighting it too." 6 months later, the coastal redwoods near Eureka were finally silent again. The Redwood Veterinary Clinic was gone, replaced by the skeletal framing of a new structure, a larger, modern facility built with clean lines and reinforced security features, designed by Serafina herself as a final, protective gift. Ilara stood by the newly poured foundation, watching the Pacific surf break in the distance. The scar of the attack remained, but the trauma was slowly fading. Dante approached her, no longer the exhausted patient or the embattled boss, but a man lighter, still formidable, but carrying only the weight of his own decisions. He knelt before her, not with the typical dramatic flourish, but with the quiet reverence of a man making a sacred vow. He held a small, antique box containing a single, simple silver band. "I won't offer you a fairy tale, Ilara. I offer you a lifetime of having to fight the shadows. But I promise to always face the darkness first, so you can stand in the sun. Will you be my wife?" Ilara smiled, tears finally streaming down her face, tears of relief and true, hard-won hope. "Yes, Dante. Always. Part 5, The Sunlight and the Cost of the Vow. 6 months had passed since Dante knelt on the foggy northern California coast. The silver band was now a permanent fixture on Ilara's hand, a silent promise worn openly in a world where secrecy had been currency. The next 6 months were arguably harder than the siege in Seattle. Dante Moretti was a man defined by control and action, watching his empire slowly, painfully, legally disentangle itself from his identity was an agonizing act of self-mutilation. He spent his days in the compound's soundproof study, not giving orders, but reviewing the endless compliance reports Serafina forwarded. Serafina was a whirlwind of calculated efficiency, managing the public transition of assets, the complex legal maneuvering, and the hostile corporate acquisitions required to cleanly sever Dante's ties. She was cynical about his retirement but fiercely protective of his decision. She had inherited not just the business, but the fight, and she faced it with cold, inherited resolve. "It's done, Dante. The last piece of the New Jersey shipping trust is clean," Serafina announced one afternoon, tossing a thick folder onto his desk. "You are officially just a very wealthy, highly guarded investor now. You should be happy. You burned the whole world down for your doctor." Dante merely looked out at the ocean, a muscle twitching in his jaw. "I am happy, Serafina. But happiness, apparently, has a weight of its own." Ilara, meanwhile, found her healing in the tangible reality of the new Redwood Veterinary Clinic's construction. She drove up from Malibu every few weeks, walking the skeletal frame, touching the new beams, grounding herself in the smell of pine and cement. She enrolled Kaiser in advanced obedience training, not for discipline, but to ensure his protective instincts could be channeled into silent, unwavering vigilance. Her hands still shook sometimes when she performed intricate tasks, a ghost tremor from Kirov's scalpel. But every time, Dante was there, not hovering, but simply present. He would rub her shoulders until the tension eased, reminding her, without words, that the hands were still hers, still whole, still capable of healing. The shadows, however, were long and persistent. 3 weeks before the 12-month deadline, a small, meticulously wrapped package arrived at the construction site addressed to Ilara. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a silver scalpel, identical to the one Kirov had used, but with a small, clean engraving on the handle, "The past is patient." It was a final, chilling message from the remnants of Kirov's alliance, a reminder that his sacrifice had been seen, and that the Moretti name carried eternal enemies. Ilara found Dante in the study, burning the scalpel in the fireplace, the silver melting and twisting in the flames. He hadn't told Serafina, needing to handle this final, personal threat himself. "It changes nothing," Dante stated, watching the metal warp. "We signed the contract the night we met. Now, we sign the exit papers." The following week, on the 1-year anniversary of the fire at the old clinic, Dante and Ilara stood in a sterile law office in San Francisco. Dante signed the final divestment documents, officially relinquishing the last shred of his involvement in any questionable operation. The immense power and control he had carried for 2 decades simply slid away, leaving him lighter, but also exposed. They drove back north, not to the compound, but to the finished Redwood Veterinary Clinic. It was a beautiful structure, fortified, yes, but bright, airy, and smelling of fresh paint and wood. The wedding was small, taking place on the newly sodded patch of ground where her old pickup truck had burned. The guests were few: Serafina, Silas, now a quiet, awkward guest, and a handful of loyal, retired Moretti security personnel. Ilara wore a simple white dress, and Dante, a sharp, dark suit. As they exchanged vows, the sun, which had been hidden all morning, broke through the perpetual coastal fog, bathing the scene in a brilliant, clear light. Kaiser stood solemnly at the altar. Dante didn't promise her ease or safety.